The annual St. Mary's Garden fete had transformed the village green of Little Wickham into a tapestry of cheerful chaos. Bunting fluttered between ancient elm trees. Children shrieked with delight around the coconut shy, and the aroma of freshly baked scones drifted from the tea tent. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly in her folding chair beneath the oak tree, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she observed the familiar dance of village social life with the quiet satisfaction of a long-time student of human nature. "Such a lovely turnout this year," remarked Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling beside her with a plate of jam tarts. "Though I must say, one can smell Mrs. Pemberton approaching from quite a distance. That perfume of hers could fell a horse." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes flickered with interest while her needles never paused. Mrs. Vivienne Pemberton, the recently widowed wife of the late Colonel Pemberton, had indeed made quite an entrance. At 52, she moved through the crowd like a ship under full sail, her burgundy silk dress and elaborate hat drawing appreciative glances from the gentlemen and rather less charitable observations from the ladies. But it was her perfume, a heavy, exotic blend of white jasmine and something mysteriously oriental, that announced her presence long before she came into view. "French, I believe," Miss Marple murmured. "Quite expensive. The sort one might wear to make an impression." Near the flower stall, Dr. Geoffrey Hartwell was making rather obvious attempts to engage Mrs. Pemberton in conversation. The handsome widower had recently taken over the medical practice, and his interest in the Colonel's widow had not escaped village notice. Mrs. Pemberton seemed to encourage his attentions while maintaining the proper degree of widowly reserve. "Shameless, if you ask me," sniffed Mrs. Adelaide Finch, the postmistress, as she passed their table. "6 months of mourning, and she's already batting her eyelashes at every eligible man in the county. That perfume alone is practically an advertisement." Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Finch's own unmarried nephew, young Timothy Finch, watched Mrs. Pemberton with barely concealed fascination despite his aunt's disapproval. The lad worked as a clerk at the Colonel's former solicitors and had been handling the widow's affairs since the funeral. The afternoon progressed pleasantly until Mrs. Pemberton approached the refreshment table where the vicar's wife was serving lemonade. The widow's distinctive perfume seemed particularly strong in the warm air, almost overwhelming in its intensity. She accepted a glass with gracious thanks, raised it to her lips, and took a delicate sip. The effect was immediate and alarming. Mrs. Pemberton's face contorted in surprise, then distress. The crystal glass slipped from her gloved fingers, shattering on the grass as she pressed both hands to her throat. Her elaborate hat tumbled askew as she swayed, gasping for air that seemed to elude her. Good heavens! Dr. Hartwell rushed forward, catching her as she collapsed. "Someone fetch my bag from the motor car!" A crowd gathered quickly as the doctor knelt beside the unconscious woman, his face growing increasingly grave as he checked her pulse and breathing. The exotic perfume that had been her signature now seemed to mingle with something else, a faint, bitter almond scent that Miss Marple's sharp nose detected despite the confusion around them. "I'm afraid," Dr. Hartwell announced quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush, "that Mrs. Pemberton is dead." The cheerful sounds of the fete died away as if someone had turned off a gramophone. Miss Marple folded her knitting with precise movements, her mind already cataloguing the small details others had missed, the way young Timothy Finch had gone pale, how Mrs. Finch clutched her handbag tighter, and the curious fact that beneath the jasmine perfume, death had brought its own distinctive calling card. The cheerful sounds of the village fete died away as if someone had drawn a curtain across the afternoon. The bunting continued to flutter in the gentle breeze, but the laughter from the coconut shy had ceased, replaced by hushed whispers and the rustle of skirts as villagers gathered in small, anxious clusters. Miss Marple remained in her chair beneath the oak tree, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, while her pale blue eyes observed the unfolding drama with the quiet attention of someone well versed in the complexities of human nature. "Doctor," Hartwell knelt beside Mrs. Pemberton's still form, his professional composure intact despite the gravity of the situation. He had covered her with a white tablecloth from the refreshment stand, and now rose slowly, his face grave as Constable Davies arrived at an awkward trot, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had occurred at what should have been a perfectly ordinary village gathering. Within minutes, Inspector Craddock from the county headquarters appeared, his sharp eyes immediately taking command of the scene. A man of middle years with the bearing of someone accustomed to sudden death, he surveyed the shattered glass, the overturned lemonade pitcher, and the crowd of villagers with methodical efficiency. "Dr. Hartwell, your preliminary assessment?" the inspector inquired, producing a notebook from his coat. "Poison, I'm afraid," the doctor replied quietly. The symptoms were consistent with cyanide rapid onset, respiratory distress, and there was a distinctive bitter almond odor, though it was nearly masked by her perfume. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. The bitter almond scent had indeed been present, though she suspected few others had detected it beneath Mrs. Pemberton's overwhelming jasmine fragrance. How convenient that the widow's signature perfume might have concealed the very poison that killed her. The lemonade? Inspector Craddock's gaze fell upon Mrs. Lathbury, the vicar's wife, who stood pale and trembling beside the refreshment table. "I prepared it myself this morning," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fresh lemons from our own tree, sugar and spring water. I've been serving it all afternoon without any problems." Mrs. Pemberton took the glass from the top of the tray. She smiled and reached for it quite naturally. "And no one else has been affected?" "No one," confirmed Dr. Hartwell, though I did notice she seemed to hesitate before drinking, as if the taste were unexpected. This detail caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. If the poison had been in the lemonade generally, surely others would have been affected. But if it had been specifically intended for Mrs. Pemberton alone, then someone had taken considerable care to ensure only she would consume it. The inspector began taking preliminary statements, his questions revealing the first threads of village intrigue. Mrs. Adelaide Finch, the postmistress, positioned herself protectively near her nephew Timothy, who stood apart from the crowd, with his face ashen and his hands clenched at his sides. "Poor Vivienne had been acting rather strangely lately," offered Colonel Weatherby, the retired military man who served as the village's unofficial authority on most matters. "Nervous, you know. Jumpy. My wife mentioned it only yesterday." Mrs. Weatherby nodded vigorously. "She came to tea last week, and she kept glancing at the windows as if she expected someone to be watching. And that perfume stronger than ever, as if she were trying to cover something up." Miss Marple found this observation particularly illuminating. In her considerable experience, people who suddenly intensified existing habits were often responding to some form of pressure or fear. Had Mrs. Pemberton been expecting trouble? "Terrible business," muttered several villagers, though Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of excitement beneath their expressions of shock. Nothing quite stirred a village like a genuine mystery, particularly one involving someone as prominent as the colonel's widow. Young Timothy Finch remained notably silent throughout the questioning, his earlier fascination with Mrs. Pemberton now transformed into what appeared to be genuine distress, or perhaps something else entirely. When Inspector Craddock addressed him directly about his professional relationship with the deceased, the young man's response was almost too quick. "I hardly knew her personally, Inspector, only through the legal matters." Miss Marple observed how his aunt's hand closed warningly on his elbow, and how both Finches seemed eager to distance themselves from any close association with the victim. Yet Timothy's obvious agitation suggested otherwise. As the inspector secured the scene and began the formal process of investigation, Miss Marple quietly retrieved a knitting needle that had fallen near Mrs. Pemberton's gloves. The right glove, she noticed, showed a darker patch along the index finger, as if something damp had touched it and dried quickly. The bitter almond scent lingered there too, curiously stronger near the personal effects than around the lemonade jug itself. The fete wound down with guilty haste, as villagers departed in small groups, their voices already weaving the first theories about what had transpired on their peaceful village green. The grey morning that followed brought with it a peculiar hush to Little Wickham, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple made her way to the post office through streets where curtains twitched with unusual frequency and conversations ceased abruptly when strangers approached. The rain had washed away the remnants of yesterday's festivities, but nothing could cleanse the memory of what had transpired on the village green. Adelaide Finch stood behind her counter like a general commanding headquarters, dispensing both postal services and theories with equal authority. A small crowd had gathered despite the early hour, drawn by that peculiar magnetism that tragedy exerts upon a close-knit community. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Finch declared to Mrs. Weatherby, who was ostensibly purchasing stamps but clearly seeking intelligence. "Though I must say, poor Mrs. Pemberton had been receiving rather unusual correspondence lately. Foreign postmarks, some of them. Most peculiar for a village widow." Miss Marple selected her writing paper with deliberate care while absorbing this revelation. Foreign correspondence suggested connections beyond Little Wickham's boundaries, perhaps relating to Colonel Pemberton's military service or business interests abroad. "Timothy has been quite beside himself," Mrs. Finch continued, glancing toward the back room where her nephew sorted mail with trembling hands. "Barely slept a wink last night. The poor boy was handling some of her legal affairs, you know." Through the rain-streaked window, Miss Marple observed Inspector Craddock emerging from Rosemary Lodge, Mrs. Pemberton's cottage, accompanied by Constable Davies carrying several evidence bags. The inspector's expression suggested his examination of the deceased's personal effects had yielded something of interest. Young Timothy appeared from the sorting room, his face still bearing the pallor of yesterday's shock. "I should mention," he said quietly, his voice barely steady, "that Mrs. Pemberton had been asking about modifying her will. She came in last Tuesday, quite agitated about some provision she wanted to change." His aunt's sharp intake of breath indicated this was news to her. "Timothy, you never said—" "It was confidential, Aunt Adelaide. But now—" He swallowed hard. She seemed particularly concerned about ensuring certain people would not benefit from her estate. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. A will modification so close to death was rarely coincidental in her experience. The post office bell chimed as Inspector Craddock entered, shaking raindrops from his coat. His presence immediately transformed idle speculation into potential evidence. "Good morning," he said formally. "Mr. Finch, I wonder if we might discuss your professional relationship with Mrs. Pemberton." Timothy's hands visibly shook as he reached for a ledger. "Of course, Inspector, though there isn't much to tell." "On the contrary," Craddock replied, consulting his notebook. "We've discovered Mrs. Pemberton's handbag is missing. It wasn't found at the scene yesterday, which strikes me as curious. A lady doesn't typically attend a public function without her reticule." Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward eagerly. "Now that you mention it, Inspector, I did notice she changed her gloves just before taking the lemonade, pulled fresh ones from her bag, which seemed rather fussy at the time." Miss Marple filed this detail carefully. Changing gloves immediately before consuming poison suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate preparation. "There's also the matter of her recent visitor," Craddock continued. "Mrs. Trent next door reported seeing a motor car at Mrs. Pemberton's gate quite late several evenings this week. A gentleman caller, she believed." The inspector's gaze settled on Timothy, whose complexion had grown even paler. "You delivered documents to Mrs. Pemberton yesterday morning, did you not?" "Routine papers," Timothy managed. "Left them with the maid, Nora Briggs." "Ah yes, Miss Briggs. We'll be speaking with her shortly." Craddock's tone remained neutral, but Miss Marple detected the underlying steel. "Tell me, Mr. Finch, in your professional capacity, did Mrs. Pemberton seem concerned about anything particular? Any threats, perhaps, or unusual fears? Timothy's silence stretched uncomfortably before Mrs. Finch intervened. The boy's told you what he knows, Inspector. He's had quite enough upset for one day. But Miss Marple had observed the telltale signs, the way Timothy's eyes darted toward his aunt, seeking guidance, and how his hands clenched when the inspector mentioned the missing handbag. In her considerable experience, young men who handled legal affairs rarely forgot such significant details without reason. Inspector Craddock's expression had grown increasingly thoughtful as he pocketed his notebook, and Miss Marple was not surprised when he suggested they might examine Mrs. Pemberton's cottage while the trail remained fresh. The walk to Rosemary Lodge took them through streets where net curtains twitched with unusual frequency and conversations ceased abruptly as they passed. The cottage itself sat primly behind a well-tended garden, its windows reflecting the grey morning sky like watchful eyes. Nora Briggs, the maid, opened the door before they could knock. Her apron starched white, but her eyes red-rimmed from weeping. "Inspector, Miss Marple," she bobbed a curtsy. "I've been tidying as best I can, but I left the study just as it was, thinking you might want to see." The narrow hallway bore the accumulated dignity of the colonel's military career. Regimental photographs, a ceremonial sword, and one imposing portrait of Colonel Pemberton himself, moustached and formidable. But what struck Miss Marple most immediately was the lingering presence of Mrs. Pemberton's distinctive perfume, clinging to the air like an invisible ghost. The study revealed itself as a shrine to methodical habits. Every surface bore the precision of military training, blotter aligned perfectly, cut glass inkwell positioned just so, even the coal fire reduced to neat grey ash. Yet on the leather-topped desk lay a square of blotting paper that had clearly seen recent use. "If one holds it to the light," Miss Marple murmured, approaching the window, "sometimes the most inconvenient truths appear." Inspector Craddock lifted the sheet carefully, angling it toward the pale morning light. Faint impressions emerged in reverse. Codic, followed by the flourish of a signature, though the rest remained frustratingly illegible. "A codicil to her will, perhaps?" Craddock mused. "Nora, did Mrs. Pemberton do much writing recently?" The maid twisted her hands anxiously. "Oh, yes. These past weeks she'd been ever so busy with correspondence. Foreign letters, too, some of them queer stamps I'd never seen before. And she had a gentleman caller twice this week, came in a green motor car." Miss Marple's attention had wandered to a shallow dish near the window where several pairs of gloves lay arranged to air. One pair, cream-colored kid leather, showed a distinctive dark stain along the right index finger, as if some liquid had touched and dried there. "She was particular about her gloves," Nora continued, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Changed them twice yesterday morning alone, and always wore them when handling her correspondence. Said a lady must maintain proper standards." The faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds clung to that stained glove, almost masked by the heavier jasmine fragrance that permeated everything Mrs. Pemberton had touched. "Tell me about yesterday morning," Inspector Craddock said, producing his notebook once more. "Young Mr. Finch brought papers from the solicitor's office," Nora replied. "Legal documents of some sort." Mrs. Pemberton read them and went quite pale, started pacing about, muttering something about being too late and how she should have known better. Then she insisted on her best gloves and that special perfume from Bond Street, the one that came Thursday in a fancy box. "Bond Street?" Craddock's pencil paused. "Maison Florent," the label said. She was ever so pleased with it. Kept the little atomizer in her handbag to refresh herself throughout the day. Most particular about making the right impression. She was. Miss Marple examined the glove dish more closely. How curious that Mrs. Pemberton should change her gloves so frequently. In my experience, ladies who develop such sudden fastidiousness are often responding to some form of anxiety. She'd been that nervous lately, Nora confirmed. jumping at every sound, checking locks twice each night. Even asked me to taste her food first, said she couldn't be too careful these days. The contradiction struck Miss Marple immediately. A woman so fearful of poison that she required her maid to taste her meals, yet who had consumed lemonade at a public gathering without hesitation, suggested either remarkable carelessness or careful calculation on someone's part. Inspector Craddock was examining Mrs. Pemberton's handbag, recovered that morning from beneath the lychgate hedge. Inside lay the usual feminine necessities: compact, handkerchief, purse, keys, but notably absent was any perfume atomizer. Remarkable, Miss Marple observed mildly, how someone's habits can be turned against them. A lady who perfumes her gloves as well as her person provides such convenient opportunities for those with malicious intent. Inspector Craddock's expression had grown increasingly thoughtful as he examined the empty handbag, and Miss Marple was not surprised when he suggested they reconstruct the events at the fete more carefully. The missing atomizer represented more than a simple oversight. It was a deliberate absence that spoke to careful planning. Their first stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Lathbury received them in her neat sitting room, with hands that trembled slightly as she poured tea. The events of yesterday had clearly shaken the vicar's wife, and she seemed eager to help despite her obvious distress. "I've gone over it repeatedly in my mind," she began, settling her teacup with careful precision. Mrs. Pemberton approached the refreshment table with that distinctive perfume, announcing her arrival well before she came into view. She asked for lemonade in the kindest way and set her handbag in the corner of the table while she drew out a small silver atomizer. "You saw the atomizer clearly?" Inspector Craddock inquired. "Oh yes, quite distinctive it was. Silver with a black bulb, very elegant." She laughed and said something about keeping up appearances, then gave her gloves a delicate spray. She took a glass from the tray. There was a bit of sugar crystallized on the rim for decoration, and she remarked, "Sticky," in rather a fastidious manner. She touched the rim with her gloved finger to clean it, then took that fatal sip. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. "And the handbag, Mrs. Lathbury? You mentioned she placed it on the table." "Only briefly. There was a small commotion when young Tommy Weatherby knocked over the biscuit plate, and I turned to help. When I looked back, the handbag wasn't where she'd left it. But then Timothy Finch appeared with it, saying Mrs. Pemberton had left it at the flower stall, and he'd fetched it for her. She thanked him quite graciously." Craddock's pencil paused. "Mr. Finch handled the bag?" "Certainly. He seemed rather flustered, poor boy." There was also an odd moment. Little Daisy Pritchard from the choir wrinkled her nose and said the spray smelled funny, not like flowers at all. I scolded her for rudeness, but children do say the most inconvenient truths. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Hartwell arrived with additional information that cast new shadows over the investigation. "Inspector, I've reviewed Mrs. Pemberton's recent medical consultations. 3 weeks ago, she asked very specific questions about poisons, their symptoms, detection methods, even antidotes. She claimed to be researching for a novel, but her inquiries were remarkably detailed and practical." "Did she seem frightened?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Quite the opposite. She appeared calculating, as if preparing for something specific. She also asked about the effects of combining various substances with alcohol or other chemicals. The pieces were forming a troubling pattern, and Inspector Craddock's next destination was inevitable. They found Timothy Finch at the post office, attempting to sort mail with hands that shook visibly. Mrs. Finch positioned herself protectively behind the counter, her expression fierce with maternal defensiveness. "Mr. Finch," Craddock began formally, "we need to discuss your handling of Mrs. Pemberton's handbag yesterday and your visit to her cottage that morning." Timothy's face went ashen. "I only meant to be helpful. I found the bag at the flower stall and returned it. I didn't do anything wrong." "Tell us about the legal documents you delivered yesterday morning. Routine papers," Timothy stammered. "Property deeds and an asset inventory. Mrs. Pemberton barely acknowledged me, just took the papers and dismissed me." He paused, then added reluctantly, "Though I did notice she was wearing gardening gloves indoors, which seemed odd, and there was a small bottle on her desk, like a perfume dabber. She was applying something to her gloves quite carefully." Craddock produced an evidence bag containing a gold atomizer. "Does this look familiar?" Timothy's eyes widened in recognition and alarm. "That's the bottle I saw. But where did you find it?" "In the waste bin behind Mrs. Pemberton's cottage, wrapped in a handkerchief. Laboratory analysis confirms traces of cyanide inside." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the small gathering. Mrs. Finch let out a distressed cry, grasping her nephew's arm. "But I never touched it," Timothy protested. "I only saw it on her desk." "Yet you had access to her legal affairs," Craddock continued relentlessly, "and we've now discovered that Mrs. Pemberton was preparing a codicil to her will, one that would disinherit several individuals, including a young man who had been promised a substantial legacy for his services after the colonel's death." Timothy's jaw dropped. "Disinherit?" "She never mentioned anything about changing my inheritance. Perhaps not directly, but the evidence suggests you learned of her intentions and took steps to prevent them." The case against Timothy appeared compelling. Motive, opportunity, and physical evidence all pointed toward the nervous young clerk. Yet Miss Marple observed the proceedings with the quiet attention of someone who had seen such neat solutions prove deceptive before. Timothy's genuine shock at learning of the disinheritance, his voluntary mention of the almond scent, and his obvious distress all suggested a young man caught in circumstances beyond his control rather than a calculating murderer. Moreover, the atomizer's convenient discovery and Timothy's clumsy handling of the situation felt almost too obvious for someone clever enough to devise such an elaborate poisoning scheme. In her considerable experience, the most apparent solution often concealed a more complex truth, and the real killer frequently remained hidden while others faced suspicion. As Inspector Craddock prepared to escort Timothy to the station for formal questioning, Miss Marple's pale blue eyes remained thoughtful, her mind already turning over the curious contradictions that suggested this village mystery was far from solved. As Inspector Craddock prepared to escort Timothy from the post office, Miss Marple cleared her throat with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being heard, despite speaking softly. "Inspector, if I might suggest a small delay? There are one or two points that puzzle me rather considerably." Craddock paused, his hand on Timothy's elbow. In his previous encounters with Miss Marple, he had learned to respect her seemingly innocent observations, which often revealed depths that formal investigation missed. "What concerns you, Miss Marple?" "Well, it's the matter of timing. You see, if young Mr. Finch intended to poison Mrs. Pemberton, why would he choose such a public venue? And why use her own perfume atomizer when he could hardly have predicted she would refresh her gloves at precisely the right moment?" Timothy looked up with desperate hope, while Mrs. Finch gripped the counter with white knuckles. Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "And there's another curious point. Mrs. Lathbury mentioned that little Daisy Pritchard complained about the spray smelling wrong. But if Mrs. Pemberton was so particular about her fragrances sending bottles back to Harrods for the slightest imperfection, surely she would have noticed an altered scent when she first used it that morning." The logic was undeniable, and Craddock's certainty began to waver. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm wondering whether someone who understood Mrs. Pemberton's habits intimately planned this murder with considerable sophistication. Someone who knew she would refresh her perfume, clean the sugared rim of her glass with her gloved finger, and provide the perfect opportunity for the poison to reach her mouth." At that moment, Constable Davies appeared at the door, slightly breathless from his hurried return. "Inspector, we've found something important in Mrs. Pemberton's dustbin. A letter with a Lisbon postmark." Craddock examined the crumpled paper, his expression growing grave as he read. "It's a blackmail demand. Return the letters, or your past goes to every breakfast table in England." Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. How very modern, and very village too. Old sins do have long shadows, particularly when they depend on the post for their revelation. This changes everything, Craddock admitted. Mrs. Finch, I understand you help Mrs. Lathbury with the refreshment preparations? Adelaide Finch's face had gone pale. I only helped sugar the rims of the glasses when the wind threatened to blow everything about. Such delicate work requires careful hands. And your gloves, Mrs. Finch? Did you wear gloves while handling the sugar? Naturally. A lady must maintain proper standards. Her voice had grown thin and defensive. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm. I think we should also speak with Mr. Webb about his poison register. Someone signed for cyanide recently, and in my experience, devoted relatives often undertake tasks that more cautious individuals might avoid. The implications hung heavy in the air. Timothy's obvious relief was tempered by the growing realization that someone else in his small world had committed murder with cold calculation. There's also the matter of Dr. Hartwell's evening visits, Miss Marple added mildly. Nora mentioned a green motor car and heated conversations about debts and promises. Perhaps the good doctor's financial difficulties provided another motive entirely. Inspector Craddock released Timothy's arm entirely. It seems we have several avenues to explore. Mrs. Pemberton's blackmailer, Dr. Hartwell's debts, and the question of who had access to both cyanide and her personal effects. And, Miss Marple observed gently, we must remember that Mrs. Pemberton feared poison enough to make her maid taste her meals. Yet she applied what she believed was expensive perfume to her gloves that very morning. Someone exploited her vanity and her trust, turning her own habits into the instrument of her death. The investigation had taken a decidedly different turn. Instead of one obvious suspect, they now faced multiple motives and opportunities, each thread leading deeper into the hidden resentments and secrets that festered beneath Little Wickham's peaceful surface. The real killer remained concealed among familiar faces, protected by assumptions that had nearly condemned an innocent young man. The investigation's new complexity demanded systematic verification, and Inspector Craddock's first destination was Webb's chemist shop, where the brass scales and neat rows of bottles spoke of methodical precision. Mr. Webb himself, thin and precise as his measurements, produced the poison register without prompting, his finger tracing down entries until it paused meaningfully. Cyanide, purchased a fortnight ago, he announced with professional gravity. Miss Nora Briggs signed for it. 1/2 ounce, for vermin control at Rosemary Lodge. Moles in the garden, she explained. Perfectly legitimate purpose. Though I impressed upon her the dangerous nature of the substance. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. How very thorough of Miss Briggs to handle such matters personally. In my experience, devoted servants often undertake the most unpleasant tasks to spare their employers. Inspector Craddock noted the entry carefully. The poison had been in Mrs. Pemberton's household for 2 weeks, accessible to anyone with knowledge of its location. Yet the timing suggested planning rather than sudden desperation. Their next stop was Dr. Hartwell's surgery, where they found the physician reviewing patient files with obvious distraction. His green Morris motorcar gleamed in the drive despite the persistent drizzle, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. Dr. Craddock began formally. We need to discuss your financial arrangements with Mrs. Pemberton and the nature of your recent visits to Rosemary Lodge. Hartwell's composure cracked visibly. She was blackmailing me, he admitted with defeated resignation. Threatened to expose certain irregularities in my practice unless I paid substantial sums. I was desperate, Inspector. The practice is failing, and I'd made foolish investments. She enjoyed watching me beg. The admission confirmed their suspicions. Yet Miss Marple observed how Dr. Hartwell's genuine distress seemed inconsistent with the calculated nature of Mrs. Pemberton's murder. Desperate men rarely planned with such sophisticated attention to detail. Their investigation was interrupted by Constable Davies, arriving at breathless speed. "Inspector! There's smoke at Rosemary Lodge. Someone's burning papers." They reached the cottage to find thin, grey smoke curling from the study window. Inside, the grate held the smouldering remains of what had clearly been a hasty fire. Nora Briggs stood white-faced with a damp cloth, claiming she'd discovered the blaze and attempted to extinguish it. Inspector Craddock stamped out the remaining embers, while Miss Marple moved to examine the windowsill. There, catching the pale afternoon light, lay a delicate scattering of granules that sparkled like hoarfrost. "Sugar," she observed quietly, touching the crystals to her tongue with old-fashioned directness. How very particular. Charred fragments clung to the grate's edges, remnants bearing foreign postmarks and partial words in scorched ink. Someone had attempted to destroy correspondence, but incompletely. At that moment, Mrs. Adelaide Finch appeared in the doorway, flushed and breathless despite the weather. "I saw smoke from the village green," she explained, her hat askew and manner agitated. "I came immediately to help." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes fell, apparently by chance, to Mrs. Finch's sensible black shoes. A smear of dampness marked one toe, and caught in the leather welting were several granules that sparkled suggestively before falling away. "What a morning for everyone," Miss Marple remarked with gentle kindness. "Have you been baking, Mrs. Finch? One finds sugar in the most unexpected places after preparing sweets." Mrs. Finch, startled, recovered quickly, and produced a laugh that rang slightly too brittle. "I helped Mrs. Lathbury with washing the fate things. Such sticky work sugar does get everywhere when one's cleaning properly." Inspector Craddock's attention sharpened noticeably. "Mrs. Finch, you'll oblige me by remaining available for further questioning." As Dr. Hartwell attended to Nora's minor smoke inhalation, Miss Marple continued her quiet examination of the scene. The displaced glove dish on the windowsill suggested someone had steadied themselves while leaning out, and the faint scent of jasmine lingered incongruously near the burned papers. "Inspector," she murmured thoughtfully, "our arsonist possesses old-fashioned manners. They attempted to tidy even as they destroyed evidence." The investigation had revealed multiple suspects, with compelling motives, yet the physical evidence was beginning to point toward someone whose guilt had been carefully concealed behind helpful appearances and village respectability. The investigation's momentum carried them back through the village streets, where Inspector Craddock's methodical mind was already connecting the scattered threads of evidence. Miss Marple walked beside him with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned that patience often revealed more than haste. Her pale blue eyes, thoughtful as she considered the curious pattern emerging from their discoveries. Their first destination was the telephone exchange, where Miss Marple requested a connection to Maison Florent in Bond Street. The conversation, conducted with her characteristic blend of courtesy and determination, proved illuminating in ways that surprised even Inspector Craddock. "Most particular about their packaging. They are," Miss Marple explained as she rang off. "Silver atomizers are always dispatched in pale blue tissue with their distinctive rosette seal. Never brown paper, and certainly never ordinary string. Yet Mrs. Pemberton's parcel arrived rewrapped. Didn't it? Someone had opened it, made their substitution, and resealed it with materials readily available in any village post office." The implications were unmistakable, and Craddock's expression grew increasingly grave as they made their way to Pritchard and Lowe's offices. The break-in there had been accomplished with professional efficiency, no broken glass or forced locks, but rather the work of someone familiar with the premises and its security arrangements. The clerk mentioned Mrs. Finch telephoning about a key. Craddock mused, examining the disturbed papers. "Most convenient timing, wouldn't you say? 10 minutes was precisely long enough for someone to slip in, locate the specific file, and depart without detection." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully while examining the traces left behind. Sugar crystals clung to the edge of a ledger, and the faint scent of jasmine lingered near the violated safe. Someone had been wearing gloves recently treated with Mrs. Pemberton's distinctive perfume, or rather, what Mrs. Pemberton had believed to be her perfume. Young Timothy appeared at the office door, his face flushed with the urgency of sudden recollection. "Inspector, I've remembered something important about yesterday morning. When I delivered those papers to Mrs. Pemberton, I saw Aunt Adelaide leaving through the garden gate. She claimed she'd been consulting about postal rates. But Mrs. Pemberton seemed quite distressed after her visit. The revelation added another layer to the emerging pattern. Mrs. Finch's presence at every crucial moment, helping with the fete preparations, arriving conveniently at the cottage fire, assisting with the refreshment arrangements, no longer seemed like village helpfulness, but rather careful positioning. Your aunt has been most thorough in her community involvement," Miss Marple observed gently, "though I find myself curious about one small detail. The sugar crystals we've discovered in various locations, they're remarkably consistent in their granulation, almost as if they came from the same source." Timothy's face grew pale as understanding dawned. "Aunt Adelaide always keeps her own supply for special occasions. Says the quality at the grocer's isn't reliable enough for proper hospitality." Inspector Craddock's notebook filled rapidly with these accumulating details. The methodical nature of the crime was becoming clear. Someone with intimate knowledge of village routines, access to postal deliveries, and the ability to manipulate both circumstances and evidence with practiced efficiency. As they prepared to return to the post office for what would undoubtedly be a crucial confrontation, Miss Marple paused to examine one final detail. On the window-sill of the solicitor's office, barely visible unless one knew where to look, lay a single thread of black wool, the kind used in sensible winter gloves. "Dear me," she murmured with satisfaction. "How very careless of our tidy friend, though I suspect tidiness itself may prove to be her undoing. In my experience, those who pride themselves on leaving no trace often leave the most telling evidence of all." The case against Mrs. Adelaide Finch was building with inexorable logic, each small discovery adding weight to what was becoming an undeniable conclusion. Yet Miss Marple knew that evidence alone would not suffice. The final revelation would require the delicate psychological maneuvering at which she had become so adept over the years. The weight of accumulated evidence demanded a careful approach, and Miss Marple suggested they return to the post office, where this intricate deception had likely begun. Inspector Craddock agreed, understanding that the quiet familiarity of Mrs. Finch's domain might encourage the kind of unguarded responses that formal interrogation rarely achieved. They found Mrs. Adelaide Finch arranging the afternoon mail with mechanical precision, though her usually steady hands showed the faintest tremor as she sorted letters into their proper slots. The post office felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer with the weight of unspoken truths. "Such a relief about young Timothy," Miss Marple began conversationally, settling into the customer chair with her knitting. "Though I confess, Mrs. Finch, there are still one or two small details that puzzle me considerably." Mrs. Finch's movements stilled for just a moment before resuming their careful rhythm. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. Well, it's about Mrs. Pemberton's perfume, you see. Such an expensive fragrance from Maison Florent, and she was so particular about quality. Yet, little Daisy Pritchard mentioned it smelled wrong at the fete. Now, for a lady who sent bottles back to Harrods for the slightest imperfection, wouldn't she have noticed such a thing herself?" 9. Inspector Craddock positioned himself near the door, his presence quiet but unmistakable as Miss Marple continued her gentle probing. "Unless, of course," Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking steadily. Someone who understood her habits intimately had made certain she wouldn't detect the substitution until it was far too late. Finch's face had grown pale, but her voice remained steady. "Mrs. Pemberton's personal habits were no concern of mine." "Oh," But they were, weren't they? Miss Marple's tone remained conversational, almost apologetic. As postmistress, you would have handled that lovely package from Bond Street. Such distinctive wrapping. Maison Florent uses pale blue tissue with their rosette seal. Yet Mrs. Pemberton's parcel arrived, re-wrapped in brown paper and ordinary string, the sort of materials one might find in any post office. The accusation hung delicately in the air, and Mrs. Finch's hands gripped the counter edge with white knuckles. Such fine quality, quite different from the grocer's ordinary stock. We've found traces of it in the most curious places, Mrs. Pemberton's cottage, the solicitor's office, even caught in the welting of your shoes this afternoon. Timothy, who had been listening with growing horror, made a small sound of distress. Aunt Adelaide, surely you didn't? Hush, Timothy, Mrs. Finch said sharply, her composure beginning to fracture. You don't understand the situation. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her pale blue eyes kind but inexorable. I think I understand perfectly, my dear. You discovered something about Mrs. Pemberton's past. Perhaps through those foreign letters you mentioned something that gave you leverage. But when she decided to modify her will and disinherit Timothy, you realized your position had become untenable. She was going to destroy him. The words burst from Mrs. Finch with sudden vehemence. After everything he'd done for her, all his faithful service, she was going to leave him nothing while she paid off her own shameful secrets. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his notebook ready. What secrets, Mrs. Finch? But Mrs. Finch had caught herself, her mouth snapping shut as she realized how much she had revealed. The careful facade of village respectability reasserted itself, though it sat uneasily over her obvious distress. I won't say another word without proper representation, she declared, though her voice shook slightly. You have no proof of anything. Miss Marple smiled with gentle satisfaction. Oh, but we do, my dear. You see, when you steadied yourself at Mrs. Pemberton's windowsill while burning those incriminating letters, you left quite distinctive traces, and your helpful arrival at every crucial moment, the fete preparations, the cottage fire, even the refreshment arrangements, speaks to someone who needed to control events very carefully indeed. The net was closing inexorably around Mrs. Finch, and her desperate eyes darted around the familiar confines of her post office as if seeking escape. The woman who had seemed the very embodiment of village propriety now appeared trapped by the weight of her own methodical nature. The game is up, Mrs. Finch, Inspector Craddock said quietly. We know about the cyanide from Mrs. Pemberton's own household, the perfume atomizer you intercepted and doctored, and the careful timing that ensured she would poison herself with her own vanity. Mrs. Finch's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, but she maintained her silence with the stubborn dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime keeping other people's secrets. The final revelation would have to wait, but Miss Marple was content to let the psychological pressure build toward its inevitable conclusion. The psychological pressure in the small post office had reached a breaking point, and Miss Marple recognized the precise moment when gentle persistence might yield the truth that formal interrogation could never extract. Her pale blue eyes remained fixed on her knitting, but her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades observing the intricate patterns of human behavior. You know, Mrs. Finch, she began conversationally, I've been thinking about Mrs. Pemberton's morning routine on the day she died. Such a creature of habit, wasn't she? Always so particular about her gloves, her perfume, her correspondence. Yet that morning, according to Nora, she changed her gloves twice and seemed unusually agitated about making the right impression. Mrs. Finch's hands gripped the counter edge, her knuckles white against the worn wood. I'm sure I wouldn't know about Mrs. Pemberton's personal habits. But you would, wouldn't you? Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. As postmistress, You handled all her correspondence, including those troublesome foreign letters. Letters that must have been quite revealing, particularly for someone with your keen understanding of village affairs. Inspector Craddock remained silent, recognizing Miss Marple's delicate psychological maneuvering. Timothy stood frozen by the sorting table, his face growing paler as understanding began to dawn. The perfume atomizer was the key, of course. Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. Such an elegant solution, if I may say so. You intercepted the package from Maison Florent, such distinctive wrapping, pale blue tissue with their rosette seal. But when it arrived at Mrs. Pemberton's cottage, it had been rewrapped in ordinary brown paper and post office string. Mrs. Finch's composure began to fracture along hairline cracks. Packages sometimes require rewrapping during transport. Indeed they do, Miss Marple agreed gently. But this particular package required very special attention, didn't it? You opened it carefully, removed the genuine perfume, and substituted your own preparation. Cyanide dissolved in a base designed to mimic jasmine, though not quite successfully. Little Daisy Pritchard noticed the bitter almond scent beneath the floral notes. Timothy made a small, choked sound. Aunt Adelaide, please tell me this isn't true. Miss Marple's voice remained soft but inexorable. The morning of the fete, you paid Mrs. Pemberton a visit. Timothy mentioned you were consulting about postal rates, but you were actually confirming her intentions regarding the will modification. When you learned she truly meant to disinherit Timothy after years of faithful service, you realized your window of opportunity was closing. She was going to destroy him. The words burst from Mrs. Finch with sudden vehemence, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking. After everything he'd done for her, all his loyal service, she was going to leave him nothing while she paid off her own shameful secrets. What secrets? Inspector Craddock asked quietly, his notebook ready. Mrs. Finch's shoulders sagged with defeat. She wasn't Colonel Pemberton's wife at all. She was his mistress, masquerading as his widow after the real Mrs. Pemberton died in India 20 years ago. Those foreign letters were from someone who knew the truth and demanded payment for silence. The revelation cast Mrs. Pemberton's recent behavior in an entirely new light. Her nervousness, the frequent consultations about poison, even her plans to modify her will. She had been preparing for desperate measures against her blackmailer. So you turned her own weapon against her, Miss Marple observed with gentle sadness. The cyanide from her household, obtained by Nora for garden pests, became the instrument of poetic justice. You knew Mrs. Pemberton's habits intimately, how she would refresh her perfume, clean the sugared rim of her glass with fastidious precision, and unknowingly transfer the poison from her gloved fingers to her lips. I calculated the dose carefully, Mrs. Finch whispered, her voice breaking. It wasn't supposed to be fatal. I only wanted to frighten her, make her reconsider. But she was so vain about those gloves, spraying them repeatedly throughout the morning. The concentration became too strong. Timothy sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his aunt's crime and the twisted love that had motivated it. I never wanted this, Aunt Adelaide. I would have found another way. You're too good for this world, Timothy, Mrs. Finch replied with infinite sadness. Too trusting. I couldn't let her destroy you the way she destroyed others with her lies and manipulations. Miss Marple folded her knitting with precise movements. Love that demands its own terms can be a most dangerous thing, my dear. In trying to protect Timothy's future, you've destroyed your own present and cast a shadow over the very person you sought to help. Inspector Craddock stepped forward with professional gravity. Mrs. Adelaide Finch, I'm arresting you for the murder of Mrs. Vivienne Pemberton. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence. The handcuffs clicked with finality in the quiet post office, sealing the fate of Little Wycombe's most respectable resident. Mrs. Finch maintained her dignity even in defeat, her head held high as she was led away, leaving Timothy to face the ruins of his carefully ordered world. As the official proceedings concluded, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with thoughtful precision. The mystery had been solved through patient observation of human nature rather than scientific detection, proving once again that the most elaborate crimes often unraveled through the smallest inconsistencies in behavior. The village would recover, as villages always did, but the lesson would linger that beneath the most respectable facades, passion and desperation could drive even the most methodical souls to commit the ultimate crime. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the post office as Mrs. Adelaide Finch was led away, her dignified posture intact despite the weight of her confession. Timothy remained frozen by the sorting table, his world shattered by the revelation that his beloved aunt had committed murder in his name. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken grief, and the bitter irony of protective love turned deadly. Miss Marple approached the young man with gentle compassion, her pale blue eyes reflecting decades of understanding human frailty. "I'm so very sorry, Timothy. Your aunt's actions, however misguided, came from genuine love for you." Inspector Craddock returned within the hour to finalize the technical details with Miss Marple, his notebook filled with the intricate mechanics of Mrs. Finch's calculated crime. They settled in the vicarage sitting room, where Mrs. Lathbury provided tea with hands that still trembled from the day's revelations. The two atomizers were crucial to understanding the method, Miss Marple explained thoughtfully, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "The gold one you found behind the cottage was Mrs. Finch's mixing vessel. She used it to prepare her cyanide solution, then carefully transferred the mixture into Mrs. Pemberton's genuine silver atomizer from Maison Florent." Craddock nodded, consulting his notes. "She intercepted the original package, opened it with postal precision, and substituted her preparation before re-wrapping it in ordinary brown paper and post office string. Mrs. Pemberton never suspected the switch. The sugar crystals told their own story," Miss Marple continued. "Mrs. Finch helped prepare the refreshment glasses, positioning herself to ensure Mrs. Pemberton would encounter that sticky rim. She knew the widow's fastidious nature would compel her to clean it with her gloved finger, transferring the poison from the contaminated perfume directly to her mouth. The psychological manipulation had been particularly cruel. Mrs. Finch had exploited every aspect of Mrs. Pemberton's vanity and habits, turning the woman's own compulsions into the instrument of her destruction. The morning visit to confirm the will modification had sealed the victim's fate. Dr. Hartwell arrived as evening settled, his face bearing the relief of vindication mixed with shame over his blackmail predicament. "Inspector, I want to make a formal statement about Mrs. Pemberton's extortion. Perhaps it will help explain the pressures she was under." "Already noted, Doctor," Craddock replied kindly. "You're completely cleared of any criminal charges." Mrs. Finch's confession was quite comprehensive. Nora Briggs had been questioned briefly and released, her purchase of the cyanide having been entirely legitimate. The poor maid faced no charges, though she would carry the burden of knowing her innocent actions had facilitated murder. News of the arrest spread through Little Wickham with the peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies the fall of the seemingly virtuous. Mrs. Weatherby held court at the tea shop, expressing shock while secretly relishing her proximity to such dramatic events. Colonel Weatherby merely grunted about never truly knowing one's neighbors, though he seemed oddly satisfied by the confirmation of his general suspicions about human nature. Miss Marple observed the village's reaction with the quiet understanding of someone who had witnessed such transformations before. "Respectability," she murmured to Mrs. Lathbury, "can be both shield and weapon." Mrs. Finch used her position and reputation to gain access, deflect suspicion, and ultimately commit the perfect crime, or what she believed would be perfect. The technical brilliance of the murder was undeniable. Mrs. Finch had exploited her postal authority, her knowledge of village routines, and her understanding of human psychology to create a death that appeared accidental while ensuring her own presence at every crucial moment. Only the accumulation of small inconsistencies, the sugar crystals, the re-wrapped package, the convenient timing had revealed the truth. As twilight deepened over the village green where Mrs. Pemberton had died, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the case. A woman who had built her life on deception had fallen victim to someone who prided herself on propriety. Mrs. Finch's methodical mind, which had made her an exemplary postmistress, had also made her a devastatingly effective murderer. Timothy would leave Little Wickham, she suspected. The weight of his aunt's crime and the village's inevitable whispers would make staying impossible. Perhaps that was for the best. New places offered the possibility of healing that familiar surroundings could never provide. The case had been solved through patient observation of human nature rather than dramatic revelation, proving once again that the smallest details of behavior often revealed the largest truths about character. Little Wickham would recover, as villages always did, but the memory would linger as a reminder that beneath the most respectable facades, passion and desperation could drive even the most trusted citizens to unthinkable acts. Inspector Craddock gathered his papers with professional satisfaction, though the psychological complexities of the case would trouble him for years to come. Justice would be served. But the human cost, Timothy's devastation, the village's shattered trust, the waste of 2 lives would resonate long after the legal proceedings concluded. As Miss Marple prepared for home, she considered the evening's lesson. That love, when it narrows to a single anxious point of protection, can become the most dangerous force of all. The weeks that followed brought a gradual settling to Little Wickham. Like dust motes finding their places after a sudden disturbance, the autumn light filtered differently through the village streets, carrying with it the subdued quality that follows revelation. Miss Marple observed this transformation from the vicarage sitting room, where Inspector Craddock had returned to tie the final threads of their investigation into a neat administrative bow. "The Lisbon connection has been resolved," he reported, consulting his notebook with professional satisfaction. Mrs. de Souza, the boarding housekeeper who discovered the real Mrs. Pemberton's letters, will face charges for extortion. Her demands had nearly bankrupted our victim, which makes Mrs. Finch's crime all the more tragically unnecessary. Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully. The codicil Mrs. Pemberton was preparing, legally worthless, never properly executed, Timothy would have inherited substantially regardless of her threats. Mrs. Finch killed to prevent a disinheritance that was largely fictional, born of Mrs. Pemberton's desperate bluffing rather than genuine intent. The irony was particularly bitter. Mrs. Finch's methodical mind, which had made her such an exemplary postmistress, had also trapped her in a logic that admitted no alternatives. Her very efficiency had become suspicious. Someone so helpful, so present at every crucial moment, eventually drew attention through their competence rather than deflecting it. Timothy had departed for London the previous week, accepting a position that would allow him to rebuild his life far from whispered conversations and sideways glances. His final visit to Miss Marple had been marked by the peculiar dignity that sometimes emerges from profound loss, as if tragedy had aged him into unexpected wisdom. Dr. Hartwell's practice was slowly recovering, the village's practical nature eventually overcoming moral indignation as his professional skill proved more valuable than his personal failings. He had quietly established a fund for Nora Briggs, whose innocent purchase of garden poison had inadvertently enabled murder. The maid continued her duties at the empty Rosemary Lodge, moving through rooms that held too many memories while awaiting the estate's resolution. The post office operated under temporary management, its former warmth replaced by brisk efficiency. Mrs. Finch's arrest had left a void that extended beyond administrative competence. She had been the village's unofficial confidant, and her betrayal of that trust had fundamentally altered Little Wickham's social dynamics. Miss Marple reflected on the case's deeper lessons as she prepared for her return to Street Mary Mead. Mrs. Pemberton's elaborate deception, masquerading as the colonel's widow while living on borrowed identity, had created the vulnerability that Mrs. Finch exploited. Yet the postmistress's crime revealed something equally troubling about the nature of protective love when it narrowed to a single, desperate focus. The perfume was the perfect metaphor, she murmured to Mrs. Lathbury, who was helping pack her belongings. Like human character itself, it had its bright top notes for greeting the world, its persuasive heart that lingered over time, and its base persistent and inescapable, revealing the truth of what remained after everything else faded. Mrs. Pemberton's top note had been jasmine and sophistication, her heart, fear, and desperate maintenance of fiction. Her base, the bitter almond scent of secrets that ultimately destroyed her. Mrs. Finch's top note had been respectability and service, her heart, fierce protective love, her base, the ruthless certainty that she alone understood what needed to be done. The village green, where death had interrupted a summer afternoon's innocent pleasures, had returned to its peaceful character. Children played where a woman had gasped her final breath, and the seasonal rhythms of rural life continued with the resilience that small communities had developed over centuries of surviving both natural disasters and human tragedies. As Miss Marple gathered her knitting for the final time in Little Wickham, she considered the eternal puzzle of how ordinary people could be driven to extraordinary acts by the very emotions that made them most human. The case would remain in her mental catalogue as a reminder that the most elaborate crimes often unraveled through the smallest inconsistencies in behavior, and that justice, while necessary, could never fully restore what had been lost to misguided love and protective desperation. The secret of the widow's perfume had never truly resided in any bottle, but in the dangerous alchemy of human nature itself. The train to Street Mary Mead departed Little Wickham on a crisp October morning, carrying Miss Marple back to familiar routines, while the village settled into its altered rhythm behind her. Through the carriage window, she watched the countryside roll past, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed another chapter in humanity's endless capacity for both darkness and redemption. Her knitting bag sat precisely positioned on her lap, needles clicking gently as the rails sang their steady song. Mrs. Dolly Bantry awaited her at the station with characteristic enthusiasm, eager for details that the newspapers had only hinted at in their restrained coverage. As they settled into the familiar comfort of Miss Marple's sitting room, with tea served in the best china and autumn light filtering through lace curtains, the final pieces of the puzzle found their proper places. The most tragic aspect, Miss Marple reflected, arranging her knitting with precise movements, was how Mrs. Finch's very virtues became the instruments of her downfall. Her methodical nature, her protective instincts, her intimate knowledge of village life, all qualities that made her invaluable to the community, ultimately enabled her to commit murder with devastating efficiency. The legal proceedings had concluded with merciful swiftness. Mrs. Finch's guilty plea had spared Timothy further anguish, while the Lisbon blackmailer faced her own charges for extortion. Most ironically, the codicil that Mrs. Pemberton had threatened to execute was legally worthless, never properly witnessed or filed. Timothy would have inherited substantially regardless, making his aunt's desperate crime tragically unnecessary. She killed to prevent a disinheritance that existed only in Mrs. Pemberton's bluffing. Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. Fear and protective love combined with incomplete information to create a perfect storm of misguided action. Timothy had departed for London, carrying with him not just the memory of his aunt's misguided devotion, but also the daunting task of rebuilding his life away from whispered conversations and sideways glances. Dr. Hartwell's practice was slowly recovering, the village's practical nature eventually overcoming moral indignation as his professional skills proved more valuable than his personal failings. He had quietly established a fund for Nora Briggs, whose innocent purchase of garden poison had inadvertently enabled murder. The post office operated under new management, its former warmth replaced by efficient anonymity. Finch's betrayal of trust had fundamentally altered Little Wickham's social dynamics. Villagers who once shared secrets freely now found themselves more guarded, perhaps realizing the fragility of their carefully constructed reputations. The sugar crystals told their own story, Miss Marple observed, accepting a second cup of tea. Mrs. Finch's superior quality supply appeared at every location where she had and worked to control events. Like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale, they traced her movements through the crime with damning precision. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with fascination. But the perfume was the real key, wasn't it? Indeed, Miss Marple smiled gently. The perfect metaphor for human character itself. Like Mrs. Pemberton's jasmine fragrance. We all have our bright top notes for greeting the world, our persuasive heart that lingers over time, and our base persistent and inescapable, revealing the truth of what remains when everything else fades. Mrs. Pemberton's top note had been sophistication and social grace, her heart, desperate fear, and the maintenance of elaborate fiction. Her base, the bitter almond scent of secrets that ultimately destroyed her. Mrs. Finch's top note had been respectability and devoted service. Her heart, fierce, protective love. Her base, the ruthless certainty that she alone understood what needed to be done. The village green had returned to its peaceful character, children playing where tragedy had unfolded, the seasonal rhythms of rural life continuing with the resilience that small communities had developed over centuries of surviving both natural disasters and human frailties. As evening settled around them with comfortable familiarity, Miss Marple folded her knitting with the careful movements of someone concluding not just a project but a chapter of experience. The case would remain in her mental catalogue as a reminder that the most elaborate crimes often unraveled through the smallest inconsistencies in human behavior, and that beneath the most respectable facades, ordinary people remained capable of extraordinary acts when driven by the very emotions that made them most human. The secret of the widow's perfume, she mused, gazing out at her own peaceful garden where no shadows of deception lingered, was never really about the fragrance itself, but about how easily our most cherished habits can be turned against us by those who observe us closely enough to understand our vulnerabilities. The mystery was solved, justice served, and life resumed its gentle rhythm, carrying with it the eternal lesson that patient observation and understanding of human nature would always reveal the truth hidden beneath society's carefully maintained surfaces.